It stops my racing thoughts. I don't get too hyper after it. If I smoke before class, I feel like I can concentrate more. All of these things are things that people have said about how weed affects their ADHD symptoms. But is there any science to back this up, or is it just wishful thinking? What we see is that this is actually a very commonly discussed idea that like weed can help with ADHD symptoms. Like they actually did a study where they scoured internet forums, specifically Reddit, and looked to see how people were talking about weed with ADHD. And what they found was that about a quarter of them were saying that weed really helped with their ADHD symptoms. Now you might be like, okay, but this is what people are reporting. Yeah, this is kind of the first layer of evidence that us drug scientists have to go through. Like, we don't know what topics are important until y'all tell us what things you're noticing as an actual patient. So about a quarter of all people brought up that it helped with their symptoms, but then we also saw that about 8% of people said that weed actually hurt their ADHD, like made them less focused. And so people say that they're self-medicating with weed, but it could actually be harming their symptoms. And then there's this added other problem in that people with ADHD are at an increased risk for developing things like addiction. So what we see is that in general, people with ADHD have more impulsivity, like it's a symptom of ADHD. And increased impulsivity is strongly linked to drug use of like all sorts, like specifically stimulants. That's actually what I did some of my former research on, but also things like weed. And we see that people with ADHD have an increased risk of developing things like cannabis use disorder, so like addiction to weed. We see that like in some cases, it's like a 3 times increased risk, specifically in adolescents. So then that leads to the question of like, does self-medicating with weed actually do anything to the ADHD symptoms, or should you avoid it because you're more likely to get addicted? So they did a recent review on this to see everything that's been done about cannabis and ADHD. And first, they found that according to like the self-report data, so the people who are just saying what they think, yeah, people do self-report that weed helps with ADHD symptoms. Specifically, they self-report that it helps more with the inattentive symptoms. So things like a decrease in focus, not so much things like an increase in hyperactivity. And then there are the case studies where they actually like treated certain people with cannabis who had ADHD to see if that helped with anything. What they found was, the case study suggests that weed might help with ADHD. But here's the problem. None of those were actually good. So those studies used like a random type of weed. So like the dosage and like the actual administration of it depended. And then basically none of them actually used validated measures of ADHD. So they're like, yeah, it helped, but none of the actual like quantitative like data that we need to show that it helped. So then you move up to like the cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. So the cross-sectional is basically like you're asking people from a variety of different groups, like people who frequently use cannabis and people who do not, like what are their ADHD symptoms like? And on the cross-sectional ones, this is where it gets confusing. So there were a total of 7 studies. 3 of them showed no effects. So in terms of like the little bar that you have here, 3 are in the middle. And then 2 say that cannabis did help. And then 2 say that cannabis didn't help. So basically you end up with nothing. The balance beam is completely flat. So the 2 studies that said that weed actually hurt ADHD symptoms, like did not improve but made them worse, they were specifically focused on those inattentive symptoms. So things like a lack of concentration or focus. Now, here's the thing. In terms of like what people said that it helped with most, they said that it helped most with those. So the science is actually kind of suggesting the opposite here. But then there are 2 studies that said that weed was linked to reduction in ADHD symptoms. And specifically, there was one study that said like CBN in particular and like terpenes really helped with this. Y'all know how I feel about terpenes. But in particular, that it might not just be the THC and CBD, it might be like the entire entourage effect of the drug itself. If you're unfamiliar with the idea of the entourage effect, this is basically saying that it's not individual like THC or CBD alone that is doing things, it's everything together. It's basically saying that like you can't take those individual cannabinoids out of the plant because the plant itself is what's helping. Now, there's not actually a ton of evidence to suggest that the entourage effect does exist. Like, we just haven't done that research yet. Although I am submitting a paper on Monday that says that THC plus CBD did some incredibly different things than either one alone. So surprising to even me, my research was in support of it. So intriguing. Now, the entourage effect was actually backed up in longitudinal studies too. So these are looking at like changes over time. Like if people smoke more or smoke less, will that make their ADHD symptoms better or worse? And what they found was that the more you took, so if you increase your weed usage over time, your ADHD symptoms were also likely to get worse. And vice versa. If you decreased your weed usage, your weed consumption, then you would potentially have fewer ADHD symptoms. Now, this is all correlational. So maybe you are just getting better ADHD-wise so you smoke less. Like, that is completely valid interpretation of the data. And we also see that there are a lot of other changes that are linked here. So people are not typically just quitting weed. When they're decreasing or stopping use of drugs, they're typically stopping all of them. So maybe it's like they stopped using coke and that was the problem. So these studies are a little sus too, so then they tried to do the best version of the randomized controlled trial. So they basically give people different types of drugs, placebo, and in this case, a specific drug that's like a mouth spray that has a 1-to-1, so it's THC and CBD, and that's it alone. And what they found was that didn't really do anything. Like, that drug did not seem to change their cognitive performance. It might have made their impulsivity and inattention a little bit better, but barely statistically significant. Now, what else is out there? Well, they've looked at things like weed and executive functioning in people with ADHD and found that there were no cognitive changes. They've done brain scan differences and found that it doesn't seem to really change people's executive functioning system in their brain. Now, there might be something there with reward. So maybe that system is a little bit messed up, because we do see that people who use more weed also had more cravings for it, and that was specifically found in the ADHD group. And we do see that people with ADHD who use weed and or blow might have different levels of the dopamine transporter, but this is all correlational. So I've heard people say that weed increases dopamine, and so it's fixing ADHD by increasing the dopamine. We do not have the science that says that. That is not a finding that's in any scientific papers. So theoretically it could be a way, but scientifically we don't have evidence of that as of right now. And there are tons of other drugs that affect the dopamine system far more than weed does. ADHD medication. And then there are also studies that suggest that if you use weed a lot, it might make your stimulants work less, but we don't have a lot more than just that. So what's the TLDR here? Well, it doesn't seem like it works well to help with the ADHD symptoms, but we have equally as much evidence to suggest that it hurts ADHD symptoms. So it's kind of a washout. This is so dependent on so many things. So it could be that if you use earlier, it's worse, and we have some evidence of this. It could be that only the full plant works. We don't know. And we, drug scientists, still can't do this research because marijuana is still a Schedule I drug federally. So maybe it does, y'all say that it does, but we don't have good evidence yet.